March 1945 didn't feel like victory yet. Not on the western edge of Germany, not along the cold, fast-moving waters of the Rhine River. For centuries, that river had been more than geography. It was psychology, a natural wall, a liquid fortress, a line that had protected the German heartland since Roman times. Every military mind in Europe understood what it meant. If the Rhine fell, Germany itself was exposed, and everyone, Allied planners included, believed crossing it would be slow, costly, and bloody. By late March, World War II in Europe was clearly entering its final chapter, but no one believed the ending would come quickly. Hitler had ordered every bridge destroyed, every crossing fortified, every approach mined or covered by artillery. The Rhine River was wide, fast, and unforgiving. The current could pull a man under in seconds. The water temperature alone could kill in minutes. This wasn't just another obstacle. It was the last barrier that still gave Germany the illusion of control. At Supreme Headquarters, the plan was already set. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, methodical to the core, had spent months preparing what he promised would be the decisive blow, Operation Plunder. It was war by calculation. 25 divisions, tens of thousands of vehicles, thousands of artillery guns, air support layered on top of air support. It was the largest amphibious operation since D-Day, scheduled for March 24. Everything had a timetable, everything had a checklist, everything was designed to remove uncertainty from the equation. Winston Churchill himself had traveled to observe it. This was meant to be Britain's crowning achievement on the Western Front. The Rhine would fall not through improvisation, but through overwhelming force. To many, this was how modern war was supposed to be fought, carefully, deliberately, with nothing left to chance. Even some American officers joked that when Montgomery crossed the Rhine, the Germans would have time to prepare a formal reception. But 200 meters south of all that planning, someone was thinking very differently. George S. Patton had never believed in waiting for perfection. To him, war was not solved by eliminating risk, it was won by exploiting moments. His Third Army had spent months moving faster than anyone thought possible, racing across France, punching through Germany with an aggression that unsettled both enemies and allies. Patton didn't see war as a set of phases. He saw it as a series of fleeting opportunities, and if you missed one, you paid for it in blood later. As his forces approached the Rhine near the small town of Oppenheim, Patton sensed something was wrong, in a good way. German resistance was thinner than expected. Reconnaissance reports hinted at gaps. The defenses here weren't built for a major assault because no one believed a major assault would happen there. German attention was fixed north, locked onto Montgomery's massive buildup. The enemy was watching the show, not the shadows. To Patton, that was everything. This wasn't part of the grand Allied invasion plan. It wasn't approved, it wasn't coordinated, it wasn't supposed to happen yet. But that's exactly why it mattered. While the war on paper still revolved around carefully timed offensives, the real war, the one that broke armies, was being shaped by speed, confusion, and surprise. Late on March 21st, Patton made a decision that would define the end of World War II in Europe. He wouldn't wait, he wouldn't ask, he wouldn't announce anything. His Third Army would cross the Rhine first, quietly, before dawn, with whatever they had on hand. No massive artillery barrage, no ceremonial buildup, just canvas boats, cold water, and determined men. It was a gamble that bordered on insubordination, but Patton understood something many commanders forgot near the end of wars. Collapsing enemies are most dangerous when given time to recover. The Rhine was supposed to buy Germany that time. Patton intended to steal it. While Montgomery finalized his schedules and Churchill prepared to witness history as planned, orders moved quietly through the Third Army. Engineers gathered assault boats, infantry units shifted under cover of darkness, vehicles stayed still to avoid detection. Soldiers sensed something unusual, something heavy in the air.
No speeches, no fanfare, just movement. The Rhine River had stood for centuries. Every general believed it would demand a price. What none of them knew yet was that the river wasn't about to fall to overwhelming force, but to audacity, speed, and a decision made in hours, not months. And by the time the world realized what Patton had done, it would already be too late to stop him.
The order did not come with speeches or ceremony. There was no dramatic briefing, no flags unfurled, no photographers summoned to capture a historic moment. Instead, it moved quietly, almost invisibly, through the command posts of the Third Army. Short sentences, direct language, cross tonight, no delays, use what you have, be across by dawn. In World War II, entire campaigns had stalled waiting for perfect conditions. This one was about to move because someone decided perfection was a luxury the moment could not afford. George S. Patton understood timing the way gamblers understand cards, not as probabilities on paper, but as instincts sharpened by experience. The Rhine River was still there, wide and cold, but the enemy's attention had shifted. German command expected a massive Allied invasion, not a sudden strike. Their intelligence focused north toward Montgomery's carefully choreographed Operation Plunder. Spotlights, artillery concentrations, troop movements, everything pointed that way. To Patton, this wasn't coincidence, it was opportunity. Patton called Major General Manton Eddy late on March 21. The tone was unmistakable. There would be no rehearsal, no second guessing. Eddy, a thoughtful officer known for balancing Patton's aggression with discipline, understood immediately what was being asked. This wasn't recklessness for its own sake. This was leadership under pressure, trusting subordinates to execute intent without waiting for detailed instructions. In modern military doctrine, that concept would later be called mission command. In 1945, it was still risky, still controversial, still dependent on personalities willing to act. Engineers were told to prepare assault boats, canvas and plywood, heavy and awkward, never designed to look heroic in photographs. Infantry units closest to the Rhine were selected not because they were fresh, but because they were ready. These were men who had fought since Normandy, who had crossed rivers under fire before, who understood that survival often depended less on bravery than on discipline and cohesion. The Third Army didn't need volunteers, it needed quiet professionals. As night settled over Oppenheim, movement began without headlights, without engines whenever possible. Soldiers marched on foot, carrying boats that weighed hundreds of pounds. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs. There was no moon, only darkness broken by distant fires and the low murmur of men concentrating on each step. Some sensed history unfolding, most didn't. They were focused on straps cutting into shoulders, boots slipping on wet ground, and the unspoken thought that if the Germans opened fire at the riverbank, there would be nowhere to hide. This was the human side of the Rhine River crossing that never appears on maps. Not strategy, but exhaustion. Not doctrine, but fear kept in check. The men didn't know if German artillery was already sighted on the water. They didn't know if machine guns waited on the far bank. They only knew the order was to cross and that quitting wasn't an option. In World War II, courage rarely looked like shouting charges. More often, it looked like silence and steady movement toward danger. At Third Army headquarters, Patton waited. Those who knew him well recognized the signs. He paced, he smoked constantly. His staff sensed the tension beneath the bravado. This wasn't just rivalry with Montgomery, though that mattered.
This was Patton testing his belief that speed and surprise could still break an enemy faster than overwhelming firepower. If he was wrong, the cost would be paid by the men now dragging boats toward the Rhine. The first assault wave entered the water late on March 22. The Rhine River here was nearly 1,000 feet wide, the current fast enough to pull boats downstream if paddlers lost focus for even a moment. The water was freezing, spray soaked uniforms instantly. Darkness concealed the crossing, but made navigation treacherous. Engineers had marked the western bank carefully. The eastern bank, the enemy's side, was a black void. In the boats, there was no room for heroics. Men sat packed together, knees locked, weapons held tight to keep them dry. Every splash sounded too loud. Every second felt stretched thin. Some later admitted they expected to be cut down halfway across. Others focused on the simple mechanics of paddling, on keeping the bow pointed at the dark line that meant land. Leadership at that level was quiet. Lieutenants whispered instructions. Sergeants watched for panic. No one talked about what would happen if the Germans reacted in time. They didn't. That, more than anything, defined the success of the crossing. German defenses at Oppenheim were thin, undermanned, and unprepared for an assault without warning. The enemy expected noise, bombardment, flares, and chaos. Instead, they got silence. By the time scattered German artillery began firing, American infantry was already ashore, already spreading out, already digging in. By midnight, multiple companies of the Third Army were across the Rhine. By dawn, thousands of men held a growing bridgehead on the eastern bank. Engineers worked feverishly, improvising ferries from captured barges and whatever materials they could find. Tanks followed, artillery followed, the impossible became irreversible. When reports reached Patton that the crossing had succeeded with minimal casualties, his reaction was not relief, it was vindication. This was leadership as he understood it, not permission, but responsibility, not caution, but calculated risk. In the final months of World War II, when Germany's defenses were collapsing but still capable of killing thousands, Patton had chosen momentum over hesitation. The Rhine had fallen, not because it was weak, but because the enemy had been outthought, outpaced, and surprised. And while Montgomery's grand operation still loomed to the north, the psychological damage was already done. Germany's last natural barrier had been breached, not by weeks of preparation, but by a decision made in the dark. What happened next would ripple far beyond the riverbanks, reaching the highest levels of Allied command and the breakfast table of the most powerful man in Britain.
By the time the sun rose over the eastern bank of the Rhine, the war had already changed, though most of the world didn't know it yet. What had happened overnight near Oppenheim was still moving through radios, field reports, and half-whispered confirmations. The Third Army was across, not probing, not testing, across in force. And that single fact carried a weight that went far beyond the number of men or boats involved. It shattered assumptions that had shaped Allied planning for months. Inside Third Army headquarters, the mood was electric but controlled. Patton's staff understood the delicate balance they were standing on. Militarily, the operation was a success. Politically, it was a minefield. Crossing the Rhine without explicit authorization was not a small breach of protocol. It was a direct challenge to the carefully managed structure of Allied command. Patton knew this. He also knew something else. Once success is undeniable, objections tend to soften. The first calls went out cautiously. Patton wanted confirmation before celebration. Reports came in steadily. German counterattacks were scattered and ineffective. Artillery fire was late and poorly coordinated. Engineers were expanding the bridgehead faster than expected. Tanks were already moving east.
The gamble had worked. The Rhine River, Hitler's final natural defense, had been pierced where no one was watching. When Patton finally informed higher headquarters, he did it on his terms. The call to General Omar Bradley was almost gleeful, not boastful, genuine excitement sharpened by rivalry. Bradley, pragmatic and measured, struggled to process what he was hearing. Crossing the Rhine was supposed to be an event, a moment, a headline. Patton had turned it into a footnote that rewrote the campaign timeline overnight. At Supreme Headquarters, the reaction was more complicated. Dwight Eisenhower received the news with a commander's dual instinct, satisfaction at success and irritation at the method. Ike understood coalition warfare better than anyone alive. He knew victories weren't just won on battlefields, but in relationships. Patton's audacity delivered results, but it also threatened balance. The Allies were a machine, and Patton had just jammed a wrench into the gears while making the engine run faster. Privately, Eisenhower acknowledged what could not be denied. Germany was collapsing. 6 months earlier, this kind of move would have been reckless. In March 1945, it was devastatingly effective. Patton hadn't broken the rules of war. He had exploited the moment when the rules no longer mattered as much as speed. But the most delicate reaction was still to come. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery learned of the Rhine crossing less than 13 hours before his own Operation Plunder was scheduled to begin. For months, his plan had been positioned as the decisive Allied blow, the final demonstration of methodical, overwhelming power. He had assembled the largest concentration of men, guns, and aircraft since Normandy. He had invited Churchill himself to witness it, and now an American general had crossed the same river with canvas boats and silence. Montgomery's response, recorded by witnesses, was cold and controlled. There was no explosion, no public anger, just a tightening of posture, a clipped acknowledgement, and a reaffirmation that his operation would proceed exactly as planned. In his view, Patton had performed a stunt. Montgomery would conduct a proper military operation. The contrast could not have been sharper. And then there was Churchill. When the message reached him, he was not in a war room or a bunker, but at breakfast. Toast, marmalade, and reports spread across the table. The tension in the room was immediate. Everyone understood the implications. Patton's crossing threatened to steal the spotlight from Britain's moment, to reduce months of preparation to something that looked excessive by comparison. Churchill read the message slowly. The Rhine had been crossed, the bridgehead was secure, casualties were minimal. For a moment, he said nothing. Those present expected irritation, perhaps sarcasm, perhaps a diplomatic deflection. Instead, Churchill did something unexpected. He smiled. "Brilliant," he said, then louder, with unmistakable approval. "Absolutely brilliant." The room froze. Churchill didn't deny Montgomery's achievement. He didn't minimize British planning. He reframed the entire situation. Patton's audacity, he argued, would pull German reserves south. It would confuse Hitler. It would weaken resistance to Operation Plunder before it even began. What looked like an embarrassment could become an advantage if viewed correctly. This was leadership at the highest level, turning rivalry into momentum, turning ego into leverage. Churchill understood something many missed. Wars are not won by one style of warfare alone. They are won by pressure from multiple directions, by forcing an enemy to react instead of plan. Later, in private correspondence, Churchill was even more candid. He acknowledged that while Montgomery's operation would be broader and more controlled, Patton's speed had shortened the war. Audacity still mattered. Risk still mattered. The Americans, he admitted, had reminded everyone of that. The news did not just travel among allies. German intelligence intercepted reports quickly. To them, Montgomery's crossing was expected, prepared for. Patton's was a shock, a violation of every assumption they had made about how the Allies would behave. The psychological impact was immediate. If the Rhine could fall without warning, then no line was safe. By the end of March 23, 1945, the Rhine River was no longer a boundary, it was a memory. And in war, once a symbol collapses, the collapse spreads faster than any army.
In Berlin, the Rhine had never been treated as just another river. It was spoken of as a destiny line, a psychological wall as much as a geographic one. For centuries, German military thinking had treated it as the final shield of the homeland. Armies could be beaten in France, stalled in Belgium, slowed in the Ardennes, but once the Rhine was reached, the war would change character. That belief still lingered in March 1945, even as Germany itself was collapsing from the inside. When the first intelligence summaries reached the German High Command, they were incomplete, contradictory, and dismissed at first as exaggerations. Reports mentioned American infantry crossing near Oppenheim. No massive bombardment, no airborne assault, no formal buildup. The assumption was simple. It had to be a reconnaissance in force, perhaps a raid that would be pushed back once daylight revealed its weakness. That assumption would prove catastrophic. By mid-morning, the tone of the reports shifted. Additional confirmations arrived. The Americans were not withdrawing, they were reinforcing. Engineers were already establishing crossings. Artillery had moved east of the river. Tanks were following. The Rhine had been breached, not symbolically, but operationally. Inside the Führer bunker, the reaction was explosive. Hitler had personally ordered the Rhine defended as Germany's final natural barrier. Every bridge destroyed, every crossing fortified, every commander instructed that the river was to be held at all costs. Now he was being told that an American general, known in German intelligence files as reckless, impulsive, dangerous, had crossed it overnight with canvas boats. The news triggered one of Hitler's now infamous rages. According to multiple post-war testimonies, he erupted at his generals, accusing them of incompetence, betrayal, and cowardice. He demanded explanations that did not exist. How could an enemy cross without preparation? How could defenses fail without warning? How could Germany's last shield fall so easily? One phrase repeated itself during that outburst, recorded by those present. That man is a demon. Patton, in Hitler's mind, was no longer just a general. He was chaos incarnate, a commander who did not fight according to rules Germany still believed governed war. He did not wait, he did not signal, he did not respect the script, and that made him terrifying. The German general staff tried to calm the situation. They argued that Montgomery's massive crossing in the north remained the real threat, that Patton's action, while dramatic, was limited, that reserves could still be repositioned, but the damage was already done, not to terrain, but to certainty. The Rhine had been crossed where no one expected it. If that was possible, then every defensive calculation became suspect. Field commanders felt the shock immediately. Units stationed behind the Rhine had believed themselves safe, at least temporarily. Now they were being told to move, to counterattack, to respond to a penetration that should not exist. Orders contradicted each other, communications broke down, fuel shortages slowed redeployments. The German army, already stretched thin, was forced to react instead of plan. This is where Patton's crossing revealed its true power. Militarily, Montgomery's operation was larger. Psychologically, Patton's was devastating. The Germans had prepared for force, they had not prepared for audacity. The sudden appearance of American troops east of the Rhine created a sense of encirclement that went far beyond actual troop movements. Rumors spread faster than facts. Entire units began to fear being cut off before they were. Interrogations conducted later revealed a consistent pattern. German officers expected Montgomery, they feared Patton. When Montgomery crossed, they braced for pressure. When Patton crossed, they panicked.
One senior German staff officer would later admit that the unexpected breach shattered the illusion that any defensive line could still be held. Within 48 hours, the strategic consequences became undeniable. Patton expanded the bridgehead relentlessly. 2 divisions moved across, then more. Roads that had been planned as fallback routes were suddenly threatened. German Army Group B found itself in danger of encirclement. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart, was now exposed. Inside Allied headquarters, analysts began to understand what Patton had truly accomplished. This was not just a river crossing, it was a psychological rupture. The Rhine had been the last excuse for delay, the last promise of control. Once it fell, even in one place, the German command structure lost its final anchor. For Hitler, this realization came too late. His obsession with Patton intensified. Reports mentioning the Third Army were scrutinized personally. He demanded constant updates. He fixated on the idea that one American general, acting without permission, had undone years of defensive planning in a single night. Meanwhile, on the ground, American soldiers advanced through towns that had never expected to see enemy troops so soon. Civilians watched in disbelief as columns rolled eastward. German rear area units scrambled to evacuate. The war, which had once seemed like a sequence of lines on maps, was now unraveling in real time. The Rhine, once described as an impenetrable moat, had become just another river behind the front. And with that realization spreading through German ranks, something far more dangerous than defeat took hold: inevitability. The sense that resistance no longer delayed defeat, but merely prolonged suffering. That shift in mindset would shape everything that followed. Because once an army stops believing in its defenses, it begins looking for exits. And that is exactly what Patton intended.
Once the Rhine was crossed, the war changed tempo almost overnight. What had been a campaign of pressure turned into a pursuit. Patton did not pause to celebrate the breach, nor did he allow his commanders the luxury of consolidation. His instinct told him something crucial. The enemy was no longer thinking in terms of defense, only escape. And an army in retreat, when pressed without mercy, stops functioning as an army at all. The Third Army surged eastward with a speed that stunned even Allied planners. Roads meant for German withdrawals were seized before they could be used. Bridges were taken intact or rebuilt in hours. Columns advanced day and night, guided by momentum rather than maps. The operational doctrine was simple and ruthless. Move faster than German headquarters could react, faster than orders could be rewritten, faster than fear could harden into resistance. This was not chaos, it was controlled aggression. Patton trusted his corps and division commanders to exploit opportunities without waiting for approval. That trust proved decisive. Junior officers were empowered to make calls on the ground. If a town could be bypassed, it was bypassed. If resistance collapsed, pursuit continued without delay. Speed itself became a weapon, one the Germans had no answer for. German units east of the Rhine began to disintegrate in fragments. Communications failed, fuel shortages stranded vehicles, staff officers burned documents and abandoned headquarters. Entire formations moved without knowing who was on their flanks. What German planners had feared most now unfolded: encirclement without battle. The most dramatic consequence emerged around the Ruhr. This industrial region, vital to Germany's remaining war effort, had long been expected to fall, but not this quickly. Patton's advance from the south and the converging pressure from other Allied forces created a tightening noose. Roads leading east were cut, rail lines were severed. Units attempting to withdraw found themselves blocked by American armor already occupying the exits. German Army Group B, once a formidable force, became a trapped mass of men, vehicles, and equipment with nowhere to go.
Inside the encirclement, morale collapsed. Officers realized the situation before their soldiers did. Some attempted breakouts that failed within hours. Others chose surrender to avoid annihilation. Prisoner counts rose at a pace no one had predicted. Entire divisions laid down their arms, not after heroic last stands, but after recognizing the futility of further resistance. This was the hidden brilliance of the Rhine crossing. It had not merely allowed Allied troops into Germany, it had shattered the enemy's sense of operational coherence. The Germans were no longer reacting to a front, they were reacting to surprises. At Allied headquarters, reactions were mixed. Admiration for the results was undeniable, but discomfort lingered. Patton's advance challenged the traditional hierarchy of planning. Some worried he was moving too fast, stretching supply lines, risking overextension. But the reports told a different story. Casualties remained low, resistance weakened by the day. German formations were surrendering faster than they could be processed. Even Dwight Eisenhower, cautious by nature, could not ignore the evidence. The aggressive exploitation was working because the enemy had already lost the will to organize a coherent defense. Patton had sensed that moment instinctively and acted before it vanished. German intelligence assessments after the war would confirm this. They noted that Patton's rapid advance created the illusion of overwhelming Allied strength everywhere at once. In reality, it was concentration through movement. The Germans believed they were being surrounded by far more forces than actually existed, simply because those forces appeared where they were least expected. This psychological pressure compounded the physical one. Surrender became contagious. Once one unit capitulated, neighboring formations followed. Officers feared being blamed for unnecessary losses. Soldiers feared being cut off entirely. The safest option increasingly became laying down arms. By early April 1945, the strategic outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany's Western military structure had collapsed. What remained were isolated pockets, fleeing columns, and commands issuing orders that could no longer be executed. The war was still being fought, but no longer being directed. And yet, amid this collapse, one tension remained unresolved. Patton's methods had delivered extraordinary results, but they also sharpened rivalries within the Allied command. Not everyone celebrated the speed, not everyone welcomed the implications, and as Patton's army raced deeper into Germany, questions about control, credit, and command authority began to surface. Those questions would soon collide with politics, personalities, and the final shape of victory. And that collision would define what came next.
By April 1945, the war in Europe was no longer balanced on uncertainty. Germany was collapsing, city by city, army by army. Yet, paradoxically, this was the most dangerous phase of the conflict, not because the enemy was strong, but because victory itself began to fracture unity. Success, especially overwhelming success, has a way of exposing tensions that fear once concealed. No commander embodied this contradiction more than George S. Patton. His Third Army had become the spearhead of chaos, productive chaos. Everywhere it moved, German resistance seemed to evaporate. Prisoners flowed west in numbers that stunned Allied logistics officers. Entire formations surrendered with barely a fight. The maps at Supreme Headquarters had to be updated daily, sometimes hourly, because the front lines no longer behaved like lines at all. But this speed unsettled the Allied command structure. At SHAEF, planners were trained to think in phases, boundaries, coordination zones. Patton thought in momentum. He advanced when opportunity appeared, not when paperwork aligned. This created an uncomfortable reality. The man producing the most dramatic results was also the least predictable. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower found himself balancing admiration with restraint.
Eisenhower valued coalition unity above all else. He understood that the war would be judged not only by how it ended, but by how the alliance held together under strain. Patton's victories were undeniable, but so was his tendency to operate at the edge of command discipline. British leaders viewed the situation through a different lens. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had invested months in carefully structured operations designed to minimize casualties and preserve force integrity. To him, Patton's advance looked reckless, even irresponsible, not because it failed, but because it succeeded without permission. Speed without coordination threatened the balance of Allied planning, and perhaps more dangerously, the narrative of shared victory. Montgomery's concern was not merely professional, it was historical. Who would be remembered as the general who shattered Germany? This unspoken question lingered behind every briefing. British commanders feared that Patton's audacity would eclipse methodical planning, turning the war's conclusion into a story of American improvisation rather than Allied design. The Rhine crossing had already bruised egos. The race across Germany reopened those wounds. Behind closed doors, cables flew between London and Washington. Words like control, boundaries, and coordination masked deeper anxieties about prestige and influence in the post-war world. The war was ending, but the shape of peace was already being negotiated. Patton, as always, was oblivious to diplomacy, or indifferent to it. He pushed forward relentlessly. His commanders received simple guidance: maintain pressure, exploit collapse, don't stop moving. The Third Army began encountering German civilians in droves, refugees, displaced families, forced laborers pouring out of camps. The human cost of the Reich's collapse became visible in ways no briefing could capture. For Patton, this confirmed his belief that speed saved lives. Every day the war dragged on meant more civilians killed, more cities destroyed, more chaos. To him, restraint was cruelty disguised as caution. But not everyone agreed. At Allied headquarters, concerns intensified. Intelligence reports warned of possible overextension. Supply officers worried fuel lines would snap. Political advisors cautioned that uncontrolled advances might complicate negotiations with the Soviets, whose armies were racing west with equal ferocity. The invisible boundary between military victory and political catastrophe was narrowing, and Patton was charging straight toward it. One issue in particular began to dominate discussions: where Patton would stop. The Elbe River loomed ahead, not just as a geographic feature, but as a political fault line. Beyond it lay territory designated for Soviet occupation. A misstep there could transform victory into diplomatic disaster. Orders were drafted, clarifications issued, boundaries emphasized. Patton bristled. To him, stopping now felt like betrayal, not of command, but of momentum. The enemy was broken. Why pause? Why allow remnants to regroup under a different flag? Why let ideology determine tactics when victory was within reach? These questions haunted Patton's staff. Some shared his frustration, others feared the consequences. They understood that this phase of the war demanded not just military brilliance, but political obedience, something Patton had never mastered. The tension reached its peak when explicit instructions arrived limiting further advances. For the first time since Normandy, Patton was told clearly to slow down, to wait, to hold. The order cut against everything he believed about warfare, and in that moment, the greatest challenge of Patton's career was no longer defeating the enemy, it was obeying his allies. That internal conflict, simmering beneath the surface, would soon spill into public controversy, reshape reputations, and determine how history would remember not just Patton, but the final chapter of the war itself. And that reckoning was closer than anyone realized.
By late April 1945, the paradox was complete. Militarily, the war in Europe was over in all but name. Politically, it was entering its most fragile phase. And personally, for George S. Patton, the moment of greatest success was quietly transforming into the moment of greatest danger.
The Third Army stood deep inside Germany, surrounded not by enemy resistance, but by uncertainty. German units continued to surrender in waves. White flags appeared in villages before American columns even arrived. Prisoner cages overflowed. The machinery of the Reich had not merely broken, it had collapsed inward, folding under its own weight. Yet Patton was restless. To him, this ending felt unfinished. The enemy had not been decisively destroyed, it had simply stopped fighting. He feared what came next, former Nazis blending into civilian life, surrendering not out of moral reckoning, but exhaustion, waiting for the world's attention to drift elsewhere. In Patton's mind, this was not justice, it was postponement. This belief shaped his behavior in ways that alarmed Allied leadership. In private conversations with staff officers, Patton spoke openly, too openly, about the post-war order. He questioned the wisdom of empowering former enemies under new political banners. He criticized denazification efforts he viewed as superficial. Most controversially, he expressed deep suspicion towards Soviet intentions, arguing that the real conflict had not ended, only shifted direction. These were not battlefield opinions, they were political statements. And politics, unlike war, does not forgive bluntness. At Supreme Headquarters, alarm bells rang. Eisenhower and his advisors understood the danger immediately. The war had been won through unity. The peace would require restraint. Any perception of American commanders freelancing politically could fracture the alliance at the very moment it needed cohesion. But Patton did not adjust his tone. When journalists began interviewing him, his candor became combustible. Offhand remarks, spoken casually, sometimes sarcastically, were reported without context. Nuance vanished in headlines. Statements intended as critique were read as endorsement. Observations became accusations. The public narrative began to turn. Suddenly, the general who had crossed the Rhine with audacity and speed was being portrayed as reckless, insensitive, even dangerous. Critics questioned his judgment. Allies questioned his reliability. Political leaders worried about optics more than outcomes. Patton was stunned. From his perspective, he had done exactly what the war demanded. He had moved faster, struck harder, and ended the conflict sooner than anyone believed possible. And now, when the fighting was finally over, he was being asked to censor himself, to pretend the future posed no risks. That contradiction enraged him. Inside the Third Army, loyalty remained fierce. His officers knew his brilliance. His soldiers trusted him. They had followed him through France, across Germany, and over the Rhine because he delivered results and protected their lives through decisive action. But loyalty in the field does not shield one from consequences in headquarters. Eisenhower made the decision quietly, deliberately. Patton would be relieved of operational command, not court-martialed, not disgraced, simply removed from the center of events. The justification was framed as necessity, stability, diplomacy. The effect was devastating. For Patton, this was worse than defeat. He had not failed. He had succeeded too visibly, too forcefully, too loudly, and in doing so, he had violated the unspoken rule of coalition warfare. Victory must be shared, tempered, and narratively controlled. When the order came down, Patton complied. He always did when it mattered. But those close to him noticed the change immediately. The fire remained, but it burned inward now. His energy had nowhere to go. He toured occupied Germany, inspecting units, visiting sites that now felt hollow. The war he understood was gone. The world replacing it spoke a language he despised: committee decisions, political calculations, image management. Even Winston Churchill, who admired Patton deeply, recognized the tragedy unfolding. Churchill understood something others missed. Patton was a weapon designed for a specific kind of war. In moments of collapse, audacity is priceless. In moments of transition, it becomes dangerous. Britain had learned this lesson painfully over centuries. America was learning it now. Patton's removal was not an indictment of his skill, but a recognition of his incompatibility with peace. And yet, history would later struggle with this truth, because when the dust settled, when analysts reviewed maps and casualty figures, one fact remained immovable. Patton's actions shortened the war. His Rhine crossing shattered German morale. His relentless pursuit prevented regrouping. His aggression saved lives by ending resistance before it could harden again. The tragedy was not that Patton was wrong, it was that he was right at the wrong time. As Europe exhaled and the world shifted toward uneasy peace, Patton stood on the margins, victorious, controversial, misunderstood. His legacy was no longer being written by battles, but by interpretations. And those interpretations would soon crystallize into a single question historians still wrestle with today. Was Patton a liability who endangered unity, or a necessary force whose leadership only exists when the stakes are absolute? The answer would not come from orders or headlines. It would come from how the war itself was remembered. And that final reckoning waits in the last chapter.
When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the world rushed to simplify what had happened. Wars, after all, are uncomfortable things to remember in their full complexity. It is easier to compress them into dates, treaties, parades, and speeches. Harder to sit with the contradictions. Harder still to accept that victory is often achieved not by perfect plans, but by imperfect people acting decisively in imperfect moments. George S. Patton never fit comfortably into history's clean narratives. His Rhine crossing was not supposed to happen the way it did. It violated expectations, unsettled alliances, embarrassed careful planners, and exposed how fragile even the most sophisticated defenses had become. Hitler had called the Rhine Germany's final shield. Patton treated it like a suggestion, and by doing so, he didn't just cross a river, he crossed a psychological threshold that Germany never recovered from. From that night forward, the war was no longer about if Germany would fall, but how fast. And speed mattered. Every day shaved off the calendar meant fewer civilians caught in the collapse, fewer cities reduced to rubble, fewer young men dying in the last pointless spasms of resistance. Patton understood this instinctively. He believed that hesitation, dressed up as caution, often costs more lives than boldness ever will. History eventually confirmed this uncomfortable truth. Post-war analyses showed that Patton's rapid exploitation after the Rhine prevented the German High Command from stabilizing any new defensive line. The Ruhr encirclement, the collapse of Army Group B, and the cascading surrenders that followed were not inevitable, they were accelerated. The war in Europe did not simply end, it unraveled. And yet, Patton paid a price for that acceleration. In the world that followed victory, his qualities became liabilities. The same blunt honesty that clarified battlefields complicated diplomacy. The same intolerance for delay that saved lives in war clashed with the slow, careful rituals of peace. The coalition that required audacity to win now required restraint to survive. Patton could not make that transition. His removal of command was not a judgment on his competence, but an acknowledgement of reality. The kind of man who breaks empires rarely belongs in the world that follows them. He was forged for moments when decisions must be made before consensus is possible. Churchill understood this, perhaps better than anyone. That is why his reaction to the Rhine crossing matters so much, not because of the praise itself, but because of what it revealed. Churchill recognized that leadership is contextual.
that history does not reward the same virtues in every phase, that sometimes the man who saves the day must step aside so others can shape the aftermath. In his memoirs, Churchill did not diminish Patton's achievement. He preserved it. He placed it where it belonged, not as a footnote to grand strategy, but as a reminder that wars are ultimately won by human will, not diagrams. And that may be the most enduring lesson of the Rhine. The soldiers who crossed that night were not thinking about doctrine or legacy. They were thinking about balance in freezing water, about not tipping the boat, about following the man in front of them because stopping was not an option. History tends to forget that wars turn on such ordinary, terrifying moments. Patton never forgot. He carried those moments with him long after the applause faded. And when he died later that year, suddenly and quietly, the world lost more than a general. It lost a reminder of something deeply uncomfortable, that decisive leadership is often messy, controversial, and misunderstood, but sometimes absolutely necessary. Today, when historians debate Patton, they are really debating a deeper question. Do we value safety over speed, process over instinct, consensus over action? The Rhine crossing forces us to confront the fact that at least once, audacity ended a war faster than caution ever could. And that truth still unsettles people. Before we close, it's important to be transparent. This story is based on real historical events, official records, memoirs, and post-war analyses. However, some dialogue, internal thoughts, and emotional reactions have been reconstructed for narrative clarity and immersion. They are grounded in documented behavior and testimony, but they are presented in a cinematic form to help the story flow and connect emotionally. The facts are real, the interpretation is human. If this story gave you a new perspective on World War II, if it made you rethink leadership, courage, and the price of decisive action, then like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next deep dive into history's most intense and misunderstood moments. Every comment keeps these stories alive. Every subscriber is one more witness against forgetting. Because when they told Patton the Rhine was impossible to cross, he didn't argue. He just proved them right before breakfast.